Test recording. Mother's first test recording. Go ahead.
When I was 3 years old, my mother took me to Dr. Lee to ask him what was wrong with me. Dr. Lee Yater had delivered all of Grandmother Lusk's children, my mother, her brother, and all of her sisters. And then he had delivered me. And he said he couldn't deliver any more children after that. I was the last one, so he considered me like his child. And my mother would just go to him and ask him anything. This time I was afraid she was taking me back to him to keep because she thought there was something wrong with me. However, Dr. Lee said there was nothing wrong with me, that I just liked to talk to my little friends, and I needed a little sister to play with. Well, I did like to talk to myself. I enjoyed talking to myself, and I've enjoyed it ever since then, till I'm 98 years old. I still enjoy talking to myself. I've just been doing it silently since then. But now Peter has found a way for me to start talking to myself aloud again. And I am thrilled. Now, I'm doing this purely for myself alone, not for anyone else. So what I want to talk about first is about my memories, because that's something that I have enjoyed talking to myself about for a long time. I think one of my first memories, when I was about 3 years old, was of my daddy telling me that Granddad Abbas has called and wants us to come to their house quickly. He had something to show us. And we went up there, and what he had to show us was just a little box. I was disappointed. But we gathered close around, and he turned some little knobs or something on that little box, and people started talking in it. And that was one of the first radios. I'm starting to cry as I think about it. He was so excited, and he excited all of us, although I didn't understand the importance of that radio. So, another memory, I have a lot of memories of when I was 3 or 4 years old. And another memory when I was about 3 years old was of hearing our phone ring in the middle of the night. and my daddy coming and quickly wrapping a blanket around me and carrying me across the street to the Dixon's house to stay. And he told me that my Lusk grandparents' house was burning. Their big 2-story house was burning, and they had to go up there. All this is so emotional for me. I didn't realize it would be so emotional. Then I remember the next morning when I woke up, I looked out the back window and I saw Granddad Lusk sitting out there. And he had 2 boxes he was looking at. So I went out to see what he was doing. And he told me one of those boxes held the photographs that he had been able to save from the fire. And he was going through them to see which ones could be kept, because most of them had some burned parts on them. Tears were rolling down his cheeks as he told me this. I have a lot of memories of that time. Another one was going up to my Abba's grandparents with my daddy, and grandmother Abba's asking me to go out and get some eggs. They had about half of their backyard was fenced off to a chicken yard. Well, I was afraid to go out there because our next door neighbor had some chickens, and when I was just learning to walk, some of those chickens had pushed me down and I'd fallen. And they were just all over me then, and I was afraid they were going to eat me up. And I was so scared of chickens every time after that. But my daddy took my hand and led me out into that chicken yard and into the hen house and showed me the boxes where the hens laid their eggs. And I was able to find some eggs, which was very exciting. And I put them in the little basket grandmother had given me and took them in the house to her. And she was so happy to get them and so proud of me. And then I stayed by the kitchen table and watched her. She was making biscuits, and I remember watching her roll them out, and I thought it was so neat the way she cut the biscuits in round shapes. Oh, I have so many memories. I remember another time when I was about 3, and our next door neighbor had a cat. It was the only cat in our neighborhood. Everybody else had dogs, but this was the one cat. And I did something to irritate that cat. I don't know what I did. but he jumped on me and started scratching me all over. And I was screaming. And my mother found me screaming out there, and with my thin baby skin, I was bleeding all over. And Mother rushed me down to Dr. Lee's, and I just remember him putting medicine all over me. And then he had his nurse, Miss Ewald, give me 2 shots. All that hurt so much. So I never wanted to be around another cat after that. And I feel that same way today. So, another memory was of, let's see, I don't know what to come next. I have so many. I remember Mother taking me over to the Dixons across the street and leaving me there one time. And she and my daddy always took me there when they had to go somewhere and couldn't take me. There were no babysitters in those days, but the Dixons were always so nice to keep me. And Mrs. Dixon gave me the run of the upstairs of their big house. She said there were only 2 rooms that I could not go in, and they were the 2 rooms on each end of the upstairs. The big bedroom of her mother's, and then the big bedroom on the other end, which belonged to Mr. and Mrs. Dixon. And Lucy Lee was, I think she was 7 years older than me. But I remember her showing me her beautiful dolls. And then she set them up high so I couldn't reach them. But she showed me other little things she had that I could play with. And I remember Frederick, her brother, who I think was 5 years older than me. Frederick showed me some little things in his room that I could play with and told me definitely not to touch them other things. Then I remember Frederick taking me to the stairs and showing me how we could slide down the stairs on a little rug. He did that bumpity bump. I went down their tall stairs on a little rug, and I thought that was the most fun I had ever had. And then Mrs. Dixon came in and caught us doing it, and she scolded Frederick for showing me to do that. And she told him he had to take me outside and put me in his little wagon and take me up and down the sidewalk riding in his wagon. That was the only safe thing out that she said that he could do with me. But then I remember that when she didn't see, Frederick would show me how we could slide down that wide concrete driveway that slid all the way down to the street. And we could do that with me in the little wagon. And then later, when I was able to ride something like a little tricycle, and any time, all the way up to when we were using skates and skating, I got to slide down that wonderfully steep driveway into the street and go slide all the way across the street. Well, of course, Mrs. Dixon had a fit when she found out he was letting me play out in the street. But actually, there was no traffic. There was absolutely no traffic around there. And so it was perfectly safe, but we were not allowed to get in the street when she saw us. So I had lots of fun at the Dixons. And I think Nell Dixon was like a loving aunt to my parents. She advised them about so many things. And her husband was on the board of directors of the bank where my daddy worked. And he was my daddy's financial advisor. So Mr. and Mrs. Dixon are both extremely important in my life. And I remember that my daddy had to go to Mr. Dixon's office once a week to take reports from the bank where he worked. And he would take me with him, and while he talked to Mr. Dixon, one of the clerks would entertain me by taking me up and down in the freight elevator. I think there were 3 stories in the building, and we would go up and down in that old freight elevator, and I thought that was the most fun. And then he let me out on the 2nd or 3rd floor where they kept the mattresses. They had a huge number of mattresses for sale. And I got to go in there and use them as a trampoline and jump up and down on those mattresses as long as I wanted to. And I loved that too. So I had Mr. Dixon's office was in the back of the furniture part of the store. So I got to have so much fun that way. And then sometimes Daddy would take me to the other part of the which was opened on the street back of that. So the store took up 2 blocks, and on the block back of it was this hardware store and the gift shop and the toy store, all in one back of it. And I can remember Daddy taking me there when he had to get little things like screws and hinges and things. He always seemed to be building something. And I love seeing all those little things. I remember thinking screws were wonderful. Anyway, and my mother would take me when she had to shop for gifts. It seemed that the Dixon's gift shop was one of the few places in town where you could buy a gift. And we had to give lots of gifts. And so I often went with my mother there when she was getting a gift, and one of the clerks would take me up on the mezzanine floor to the toy department to entertain me. And oh, I loved that toy department. That was just like heaven to me. And the things I loved the most were the little cars that you could sit in and drive around going push, push, back and forth. And there was a little fire truck that I liked the most. And I loved those little cars. And I wanted my parents to buy that little fire truck for me. But they said it cost too much money and we couldn't buy it. But I had fun with it when I got to go to the store. It seems strange that I wanted that little fire truck because I was scared to death of fire engines. Any time I heard one, I was afraid he was going to run over me. And I remember that we often sat out in our front yard at night because the house was too hot and the backyard was hotter than the front yard because of all the fences. So the front yard was the least hot. And my parents would set chairs out there for themselves and for the neighbors. Some of the neighbors always came over and sat with them. And they put up an old army cot for me to lie on and go to sleep on while they visited out there. And I remember one time they had already gone into the house for some reason and had left me out on the cot and were going to come back and get me in a few minutes. Well, while I was out there by myself, I heard a fire engine and I was petrified. And so for some reason, I thought I had to save the cot from the fire engine. And I tried to pull it over to the front steps. And I got it over in front of the steps. And I couldn't get it up any higher. And I kept hearing the fire engine coming. And I was scared to death and I was crying. My parents came out there and found me sitting on the front steps, holding on to the cot, trying to pull it and crying. That's how crazy I was. One time, I remember when we were all sitting out there and I was lying on the cot, all of a sudden, my daddy said he saw a light moving in the Nimmel's house across the street, and he knew they were out of town. And our neighbor who was sitting with us and Daddy said they had to go over there because it must be robbers in the house. And Daddy quickly ran in the house and got his gun, his pistol, and they went over there and went in the house, and we heard gunshots, and oh, we were terrified. But then Daddy came back in a little while, and he said he had just shot up in the air that they had run the thieves into the backyard, and they climbed over the back fence and ran away before they had had a chance to take anything. And they just let them go because in those days there really wasn't anything they could do with them. There was a jail, but it was very small and could only hold the most serious of the criminals. And we had no policeman in our town yet, only a sheriff for the whole county, and it was a big county, so it was every person for themselves. And there was quite a bit of home robberies, and everybody had a gun and had to go after the robbers. I remember another time when the phone rang at night and we were in bed, and my I heard my daddy come in and get his pistol and rush out, and this time he drove off, and my mother came and got in bed with me, and she hugged me. She was scared to death, and she said that I knew that Daddy had some calves in the lot down at the end of our street, where Cousin Bill owned that land and he managed it. And somebody who lived near there had phoned and said that they saw a truck going into the pasture, and they thought it was cattle rustlers because there had been quite a bit of rustling around there. So that's what Daddy thought it was, and so he had gotten the gun and drove off down there real fast. And my mother laid next to me and prayed that he would be safe. She was afraid he would get in a gun battle with the rustlers. That's what she expected to happen. But he came back and said that when he got there, they hadn't gotten the calves in the truck yet. And he just shot up in the air and they got in the truck and drove off. So they didn't respond any or do any damage. But those were just some of the examples of the kind of life we had. And I remember another time when I'm trying to think which one I want to tell next, but down at the end of the street also, they had built a little rodeo arena, and they were having bull riding, and my daddy took me with him to the bull riding. Well, there was just, one set of bleachers, just, a few people there. But they had this bull riding, and all of a sudden the bull got over the fence and headed for us on the bleachers. And he started up the bleachers. Well, everybody, of course, was screaming and climbing up to the very top of the bleachers. And it seemed like it took a long time for the cowboys to get the bull roped and got back in an enclosure. I'm sure it didn't take very long, but it seemed like forever. And my daddy was holding me and I was screaming. Most people were screaming. But anyway, when they got the bull under control, then we climbed back down. And I remember Daddy walking real fast to take me home. And he was holding me real tight. And I dreamed about bulls going after me so many times after that. I was so afraid of bulls. Another time, I remember the circus coming. And this was all when I was 3 or 4 years old, all these memories. And in those days, the circus train, would stop down at the railroad yards, and then they would parade all the way from the train cars up to the grounds for the circus show. And I just remember standing down. We lived on the corner lot, and you could see pretty far down the side street which led toward town. And I can remember standing out at that corner with my mother and watching for the circus parade to come and finally seeing it and how exciting it was. And I remember especially the calliope playing. I love that calliope music. But anyway, so we got to see the circus parade up close. And then later, my daddy took me out there. Well, I should say, in the circus parade, the elephants were carrying the tent poles and the rolled up tent. And because they didn't have any big wagons, you see, it just come on the train. And the elephants carried all that to the grounds and stood around while the men used the elephants to put up the tent. My daddy took me down to see all that. We had passes to the circus grounds because Daddy was managing that land for Cousin Bill. I remember another time when my daddy was flying a kite for me down there at the end of the road. And two of the neighborhood boys who were a little older than me were down there with us. And Daddy said eventually that he had to go back home. And the boys were pulling the kite in, and I just didn't want to leave. And so Daddy asked the older boy to bring me home. So I got to stay till the kite was all down and put away. And then we walked back. And as we were walking back, I saw, lo and behold, I saw at the side of our house on the side street an ambulance stopping. Oh, I was petrified. I knew that ambulance had come to take my parents away, and I was scared to death. And the hospital was just about 3 long blocks back of us. And I was used to ambulances coming by, and they always frightened me. But this one stopped at the side of our house. And I couldn't see who got out, but I just ran as fast as I could to get down there. And I got there when the ambulance was gone, and I went in the house, and I went all through the house, and I couldn't see anybody, and I was calling my parents. I was so afraid. I was calling my parents, and I went into the bathroom finally, and my mother was in there kneeling in front of the bathtub. And in the tub were my two little cousins, Dawn and Frances, who were just a year younger than me. They lived in Temple. And they were in our bathtub, and my mother was giving them a bath. I thought, what on earth is my mother taking care of those girls for? And I called mother and asked her what happened, and she completely ignored me. She was so busy with them. Well, I just felt then, and my daddy wasn't there, and I felt nobody loved me, and my life was over. And I went out in the backyard and climbed back in a big bush in the furthest corner of the backyard and sat there and cried. And my daddy eventually found me there. And he took me up in his arms, and then he sat down on a bench, and he told me that my Uncle Raymond, who lived in Temple, and his family had had a bad wreck coming to Cleveland, and that Aunt Bess, his wife, was very badly injured, and they had to get her onto the hospital as quick as they could. And he didn't think his little girls, Dawn and Frances, were injured, so he left them at our house for my mother to take care of. And so he explained all that, and then I went back in the house, and by then, I found that Mother had discovered when she was washing Dawn, she had discovered her neck was real bloody all the way across. And of course she was very frightened, and she called Daddy, I guess, on the phone to come back. Daddy had gone to the hospital to see about Aunt Bess, and she called Daddy to come back and get Dawn and take her to the hospital, which he did. And they put clamps on her neck. They said they couldn't sew it there, so they put clamps all across the front of her neck. Anyway, so when I finally got in the house, Dawn and Frances were in my bed wearing my nightgowns, and my mother was hovering over them and ignoring me, and I felt completely left out. I thought my mother didn't love me anymore. And she kept them for about a week. And of course they didn't have any clothes there, so they had to wear my clothes. And she had to do things for them all the time. She eventually took care of me too, but from then on I had some feelings of jealousy toward those cousins, and they had a special relationship with my mother, which lasted the rest of her life. Naturally, that was the course natural. And when I got older, I understood it. But anyway, I just remember how frightened I was at the time. And I'm trying to think. There's so many more memories right now. I think I'm gonna have to take a break and think for a minute to remember the others.